She pointed her finger directly at his face in front of 200 employees and said the words that would cost her everything. "You're fired. Get out of my building." The room went dead silent. The man she just humiliated didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't even raise his voice. He simply picked up his old backpack, nodded once, and walked toward the exit like a man who had already won. Nobody in that building knew why. Not yet. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe a man's worth is more than his jacket, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning Caleb Thompson walked into Harrington International for the first time as an employee, he made a decision that most men with his kind of money would never even consider. He left everything behind. Not just the penthouse, not just the cars, not just the private security team that followed him everywhere when the world still knew his name. He left behind the version of himself that people respected, the version that made other men straighten their ties when he walked into a room, the version that caused executive assistants to scramble and board members to rehearse their presentations 3 times before sitting across from him. He left all of it in a storage unit in Maryland, and he replaced it with a faded navy jacket he bought for $11 at a Goodwill on Route 1, a canvas backpack that had been repaired twice with electrical tape, and a pair of boots that had seen better years. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror that morning for a long time. His daughter Maya came and stood beside him. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, deep brown and impossibly warm, the kind of eyes that saw straight through whatever face a person was wearing. She looked at his reflection for a moment, then tilted her head. "Daddy," she said, "you look different." Good different or bad different? Maya studied him seriously, the way only a 7-year-old can study something. "I don't know yet," she said. He laughed. And for a moment, just one moment, the weight of what he was about to do lifted off his chest. He crouched down and held her face in both hands. "Mrs. Patterson is going to pick you up from school today," he said. "And I need you to do something for me, okay?" "What?" "If anybody asks where your daddy works, what do you say?" Maya scrunched her nose. They had practiced this. "You work in an office." "And if they ask which office?" "Just an office, Daddy, the kind with boring people and bad coffee." He kissed her forehead and stood up. "That's my girl." He had been planning this for 8 months. It wasn't impulsive. Nothing Caleb Thompson did was impulsive. That was something the people who underestimated him never understood. They looked at his quiet manner, his unhurried speech, his preference for simple food and simple clothing, and they assumed simplicity meant slowness. It didn't. It meant discipline. He had built Harrington International from a 40-page business plan and a loan he took out against his first apartment when he was 26 years old. He had poured 12 years of his life into that company, fighting for contracts when nobody believed in him. Hiring people other firms turned away. Building a culture based on one principle that he said out loud at every all-hands meeting in the early years. "We see people here, all of them." But Caleb had stepped back 5 years ago when his wife Diane got sick. And when Diane died, he stepped back further. He gave operational control to Victoria Harrington, a brilliant strategist. He had recruited himself, a woman who could read a balance sheet the way a musician reads sheet music fast and instinctively, and without missing a single note. He trusted her completely. And then slowly, he started hearing things. Not from executives. Executives always told him what he wanted to hear. He heard it from a woman he met at Maya's school. A woman named Grace, who had worked at Harrington for 3 years, before she was passed over for a promotion she was more than qualified for. He heard it in the way she described the interviews, the way the panel had looked at her hands, at her clothes, at the way she talked, and had made a decision in the first 4 minutes that had nothing to do with her actual abilities. He heard it again from his barber, a retired man named Curtis, who had a nephew that couldn't get past the second round at Harrington, despite having a master's degree in computer engineering. He heard it a third time from a researcher who published an anonymous report about hiring culture at large tech companies, a report that, if you knew how to read between the lines, was pointing directly at Harrington International. Caleb read that report 3 times. Then he called Richard Coleman, the man who had been his mentor since the beginning, and he said, "Richard, I need to know if what they're saying is true." And Richard, who was 71 years old and had been watching the company from a distance for the past several years, said something that Caleb never forgot. "Caleb, the only way to know the truth about any company is to walk in the front door as nobody." Caleb had hung up the phone and sat in the silence of his home office for 45 minutes. Then he picked up a notepad and started writing. Joe. The HR process at Harrington took 3 weeks. He applied under his real name, Caleb Thompson, because he wasn't willing to lie outright. But he had restructured his financial identity years ago, and Caleb Thompson, the private investor, didn't appear in the same searches as Caleb Thompson, the public face of a tech empire. He had been careful about that. The application was for an entry-level operations associate position. The kind of role that involved scheduling data entry, coordinating between departments, the kind of invisible work that kept a company breathing but rarely got acknowledged at the company retreat. He filled out the form at a library. He listed his most recent employer as a small logistics consulting firm, one he actually owned through a subsidiary, so every part of the paperwork was technically true. His educational history went back to his real degrees, a bachelor's in business from Howard University and an MBA from the University of Chicago. He did not include the honorary doctorates. He did not include the Forbes profiles. He included nothing that would connect him to the man whose signature was still on the original Harrington International Incorporation documents. 3 weeks later, he got a call from someone named Amanda Pierce, Senior HR Manager. Her first words to him were, "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be honest with you. Your application caught some attention." He thought for half a second that the cover had been blown. "What kind of attention?" he asked carefully. "Well," Amanda said, and he could hear a slight pause, a recalibration in her voice. "We don't typically see candidates with a Howard degree applying for this type of position. Usually that background goes toward our management track applicants." "I understand," Caleb said, "but I'm interested in this role." Another pause. "Can I ask why?" "I like working with people," he said. "I find the operational side of things more interesting than most people expect." There was a silence on the line that told him everything he needed to know about Amanda Pierce. She didn't believe him. Not because his answer was unconvincing, it was perfectly reasonable, but because something about him had already been categorized in her mind, and his answer didn't fit the category she'd placed him in. She wasn't sure what he was doing there, but she was already deciding that whatever it was, it probably wasn't good enough. "We'll schedule you for an in-person interview next Thursday," she said finally. "Thank you," Caleb said. "I'll be there." He arrived 12 minutes early. Amanda Pierce kept him waiting for 22 minutes past the scheduled time. He sat in the lobby and watched the building he had designed the layout for 17 years ago. The entrance atrium had been his idea. He'd insisted on natural light on a space that felt welcoming rather than corporate and cold. He'd wanted people to walk in and feel like they were entering somewhere that took them seriously. Now he sat in it as a stranger and watched how the receptionist greeted people. There were 3 people who walked in during those 22 minutes. The first was a young woman in a tailored blazer carrying a laptop bag. The receptionist smiled before she even reached the desk, offered her coffee, and called her by name. The second was a man in a construction uniform who came to deliver a package. The receptionist pointed to a drop box without looking up. The third was Caleb Thompson, who had already been sitting there for half an hour, and to whom the receptionist had not said a single word, beyond, "Amanda will be right with you." He noted all of it. Not with anger, with purpose. Amanda Pierce walked out looking exactly the way her voice had sounded on the phone, efficient, confident, and carrying something beneath her professionalism that she probably didn't know showed on her face. She looked at him. And Caleb saw it, that rapid scan, that almost imperceptible recalibration that happens in the space of 2 seconds when a person's reality doesn't match their expectation. She had expected someone older maybe, or younger, or different in some way she couldn't have articulated if you pressed her. What she got was a tall black man in a clean but clearly inexpensive jacket, carrying a backpack with tape on one of the straps, sitting with the quiet ease of someone who had never once in his life been made to feel like he didn't belong somewhere. That ease, he knew, was probably the most confusing part of him for people like Amanda. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "thanks for your patience." She didn't apologize for being late. "Of course," he said and stood. The interview lasted 40 minutes. He answered every question directly, clearly, and in a way that demonstrated he understood the operational complexity of the company at a level she wasn't prepared for. He watched her brow furrow twice, once when he described a supply chain inefficiency in language that was too precise for someone who supposedly had no background in it, and again when she asked him where he saw himself in 5 years, and he answered with something so measured and thoughtful that she had no follow-up question. At the end, she shook his hand. "We'll be in touch," she said. 6 days later, he got an email offering him the position. Starting salary, $43,000 a year. He accepted within the hour. His first day, he wore the jacket. He arrived at 7:42 a.m., which was 18 minutes before anyone else in his department. He found his desk a low-traffic corner of the 4th floor, the kind of spot where ambient noise accumulates and natural light doesn't quite reach, and he sat down and opened the system they'd given him access to. Within 4 hours, he had identified 3 inefficiencies in the current operations workflow that were collectively costing the company somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 a month in redundant vendor fees. He didn't report them. Not yet. He wrote them in a notebook instead. Old habit. By the end of the first week, he had filled 6 pages. The other employees on the 4th floor fell into roughly 3 categories in their relationship to Caleb. The first group ignored him completely. They were busy with their own work, their own deadlines, their own complicated relationships with the department hierarchy, and a new operations associate wasn't worth the energy of curiosity. The second group was politely neutral. The kind of people who would say, "Good morning," ask about his weekend if they were getting coffee at the same time, and never once make him feel unwelcome, but also never quite invite him further in. The third group, smaller than the first 2 combined, was led informally by a man named Derek, who sat 3 desks away from Caleb and who had apparently appointed himself the cultural immune system of the 4th floor. Derek was 29 years old, had been at Harrington for 4 years, wore shirts that were slightly too fitted, and had a way of talking about the company that suggested he believed his continued employment was doing the company a favor. On Caleb's 3rd day, Derek came and stood at the edge of his desk. "So, what's your background, man?" he asked, not unfriendly, but not warm. "Operations," Caleb said. "Before this, consulting mostly." Derek nodded slowly, looking at Caleb's desk setup, which was a single legal pad, a pencil, and the company-issued laptop. "How'd you end up here?" Derek asked. "I mean, no offense, but this isn't exactly the role people fight for, you know what I mean? This is kind of a transitional slot." Caleb looked at him. "Maybe for some people," he said. Derek waited for more. Caleb didn't offer any. "Right," Derek said, and walked away. Amanda Pierce began stopping by the 4th floor with a frequency that had nothing to do with her actual job responsibilities. At first, Caleb assumed it was coincidence. By the 2nd week, he understood it was surveillance. She never said anything directly. She would appear near the coffee station, talk to Derek or one of the other employees, and in the middle of the conversation, let her eyes drift toward Caleb's corner of the floor. He always had something in front of him when she looked. But twice, when she didn't think he was paying attention, he caught her watching him the way someone watches a stray animal that has wandered into a neighborhood, not angry exactly, but definitely calculating how to make it leave. On a Tuesday afternoon in his 3rd week, she called him into a small conference room. "We're making some adjustments to your assignment portfolio," she said, not looking up from the papers in front of her. "Okay," Caleb said. We're moving you to the vendor correspondence archive. It's a large backlog, and it needs someone with strong attention to detail. He knew what the vendor correspondence archive was. It was where work went to disappear. Thousands of files that needed to be categorized and filed. Work that required no skill and no judgment and no interaction with the company's actual functioning. It was the kind of assignment that was used in two ways: as punishment or as a gentle signal to someone that their future at the company had no particular ceiling. Amanda Pierce was sending him both messages at the same time. "I can do that," Caleb said. She looked up then, briefly. "Good," she said. "We'll expect your first report by end of week." He nodded and stood to leave. "Mr. Thompson," she said just as he reached the door. He turned. "This role, I want to make sure expectations are clear. We need reliability here more than creativity. Do you understand what I mean?" He understood exactly what she meant. "Yes," he said. "I do." And he walked back to his desk and opened the vendor archive and started the work that no one expected him to do anything interesting with. He finished the first phase in 2 days. And inside it, buried in 17 years of vendor correspondence that no one had looked at closely since the company moved to a new filing system, he found something. He almost missed it. It was in a series of communications from a logistics contractor that had been terminated 4 years ago. On the surface, the correspondence was routine: contract renewals, scope adjustments, billing disputes. But there was a gap. A 42-day gap in 2021 where the billing continued at the original rate, despite a service reduction amendment that had been signed and filed on the same date the gap began. The overpayment was $340,000. He stared at the number for a long time. Then he checked the authorization signatures on both documents. Then he pulled the banking records that were embedded in the archive. The money had been returned. But it had been returned 9 months later, and the difference in the interim, a short-term loan effectively made by the vendor, had never been formally documented. He wrote the file number and the dates in his notebook. He didn't know yet if it was negligence or something else, but he knew that it was exactly the kind of thing that in a healthy company would have been caught and reported and addressed within weeks. Not quietly corrected 9 months later with no paper trail and no accountability. He closed the archive for the day. And that evening he called Richard Coleman. "I'm 2.5 weeks in," he said. "What are you seeing?" Richard asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The building is still standing," he said, "but the foundation has cracks in it that nobody's looking at." Richard sighed. "Is it bad?" "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Caleb said. "The people are good, most of them. The system they're inside of is something else. And Victoria. I haven't encountered her directly yet," Caleb said, "but I'm starting to understand the culture she's built, or allowed to grow." There was a pause. "Be careful, Caleb." "I'm always careful." "No," Richard said quietly. "You're always right. That's different. Being right doesn't always protect you." Caleb looked at the notebook on his desk. "It will this time," he said. "That's all." He had been at the company for 31 days when Victoria Harrington came down to the 4th floor. He heard about it before it happened. A current of nervous energy moved through the office that morning, like weather rolling in the kind of shift in atmosphere that only happens when someone important is about to appear. Keyboards got quieter. Posture improved. The ambient hum of the 4th floor recalibrated. He kept working. He learned later what had happened that morning. A major partnership deal with a Singapore-based tech consortium had collapsed. Not because the technology was wrong, but because the presentation team had underestimated the cultural expectations of their partners in a way that anyone with real operational knowledge of the region could have caught in the preparation phase. Caleb had read about the deal in the internal briefings he'd been quietly compiling. He had thought when he first read the preparation documents that there were 3 or 4 adjustments that would have significantly improved the reception of the pitch. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't been asked. That was the thing about being invisible: people didn't ask you for things, and so you couldn't offer them without overstepping the carefully maintained boundary of your assigned place. Victoria Harrington walked onto the fourth floor at 11:14 a.m. She was dressed in charcoal gray. Her posture was the posture of someone who had been told her whole life that how she stood in a room was a form of communication, and who had decided to say something loud and permanent with it. She moved with the certainty of someone who hadn't been truly surprised by anything in years. She was also clearly furious. Not visibly furious, she had the kind of controlled fury that the very powerful develop over time, where the surface stays smooth, even when everything underneath is at temperature. But Caleb could see it. He was watching her from the edge of his peripheral vision. He had years of practice reading rooms from angles. She walked through the floor. She spoke briefly with 2 department managers. She looked at the screens of 3 employees, not asking to just moving close enough that the screen became visible and the employee understood they were being evaluated. Then she came to rest near Caleb's corner of the floor. She stood about 8 feet away from him, speaking with a project lead named Elaine, and in the middle of their conversation, her eyes moved to Caleb's desk. He was doing the archive work. He had his notebook open beside the laptop. He had a pencil in his hand. He was not hurrying. He was not performing productivity. He was just working. She looked at him for a moment, that calculating rapid assessment that he had come to recognize as something Victoria Harrington did unconsciously, always measuring, always comparing. And then something in her expression shifted. Not to recognition. She didn't know him. It shifted to irritation. Specifically, the kind of irritation that certain people feel when they see someone who is not performing distress in a moment when distress seems like the appropriate response. The deal had collapsed. The floor was tense. Everyone else was carrying the visible weight of it. And Caleb Thompson was sitting there writing in a notebook with the unhurried focus of a man at a library on a Saturday morning. She said something to Elaine that he couldn't hear. Elaine glanced at him, then quickly looked away. Victoria turned and walked back toward the elevator bank. But she paused. She turned back. And she walked directly toward Caleb's desk. He looked up at the exact moment she stopped in front of him. "You," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Yes." "What are you working on?" "Vendor archive correspondence," he said. "The backlog from—" "I know what the archive is," she said. "I'm asking what you are working on." He held her gaze. "Vendor archive correspondence," he said again without changing a word. The second repetition landed differently than the first one. He knew it would. He'd said it the exact same way both times, which was the point. He wasn't being defiant. He was simply answering the question she'd asked calmly, without the performance of anxiety that she was used to receiving from people in his position. She stared at him. Behind her, he could feel the entire floor watching this exchange, with the focused attention of people who understood that something significant was happening, but couldn't yet define what. Amanda Pierce appeared from the direction of the conference rooms. She had an instinct for these moments. She seemed to materialize whenever the potential for authority to be exercised was in the air. "Victoria," she said smoothly, "this is one of our newer operations associates. He was assigned to the archive project last week." Victoria didn't look at Amanda. She was still looking at Caleb. "You don't seem worried," she said to him. "About?" he asked. "About anything," she said. "Should I be?" he said. The room went the kind of quiet that has texture. He watched her process the answer. He had not been rude. He had not raised his voice. He had not challenged her. He had asked a genuine question in a tone that was so absent of defensiveness that it offered her nothing to push against, which was exactly what made it so infuriating to someone like her. Amanda stepped slightly forward. "He's very new," she said. The phrase carried the implication, he doesn't know better yet. Victoria glanced at Amanda, then back at Caleb. "What's your name?" she asked. "Caleb Thompson." She nodded slowly. "Mr. Thompson," she said. "Can you tell me what you've actually contributed since you started here?" He didn't hesitate. "I've completed the first phase of the archive project. I've also identified several operational irregularities in the vendor documentation that I'd planned to report to the appropriate channels. Victoria blinked. It was the smallest possible tell, a single blink where there should have been none, but he caught it. What kind of irregularities? She asked. Billing discrepancies? Authorization gaps? Nothing catastrophic but significant enough to warrant a formal review. Amanda's expression had gone very still. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Send the findings to Amanda by end of day, she said. Of course, Caleb said. She turned to leave, and then Amanda said it. He would replay the moment many times afterward, the exact way Amanda said it, the precise cocktail of calculation and judgment that produced those 8 words. Victoria, Amanda said. He doesn't really fit the image of this company. Victoria stopped. She turned back toward Caleb, and she looked at him the way someone looks at an item they're deciding whether to keep or return. She looked at the jacket, at the backpack with the repaired strap, at the notebook and pencil on a desk with no personal items, no photos, no coffee mug. She made a decision. It was the decision that would in 36 hours bring 10 black SUVs to the front of the building and stop the entire city block. But in that moment, it looked like nothing more than a powerful woman exercising the most basic form of the power she had been given. She squared her shoulders. Mr. Thompson, Victoria Harrington said in the voice she used when she wanted something to be heard clearly and remembered permanently. You're done. Clear your desk and leave this building immediately. Not, we're going to have to let you go. Not, this isn't working out. You're done. 2 words. Direct. Final. Delivered in front of 200 people on a floor that had gone absolutely completely motionlessly silent. Caleb looked at her. He looked at Amanda. He looked at Derek, who was watching from 3 desks away, with the expression of someone who is witnessing an accident in slow motion. He looked at Elaine, who had looked down at her keyboard. He looked at the employee badge in his hand. He'd been holding it when she walked over. He'd been about to reclip it to his jacket. He held it for a moment. The whole room waited. He could feel what they were waiting for. The protest. The argument, the desperate bid for reconsideration that fired employees make when they have nothing to fall back on. The scene that would make this story make sense to everyone watching it. He thought about Maya. He thought about Diane and the way she used to say, "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Caleb. But someday the right people will need to see it." He thought about all the people in this building who had been sent to invisible corners and assigned to disappearing work and quietly pushed toward exits because someone had looked at them and made a decision before hearing a word. He put the badge down on the desk. He picked up his notebook. He picked up his backpack. And he looked at Victoria Harrington one final time. Not with anger, not with defeat, with something quieter and more permanent than either. "Thank you for the opportunity," he said, and he walked toward the elevator. The entire floor watched him go, in a silence so complete that you could hear the sound of the elevator doors opening from halfway across the room. He stepped inside. He pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. And in the final second before the doors met, just before the gap between them disappeared, he let himself exhale. Because the part of this, he had been dreading the part where he had to stand there and be underestimated, one final definitive time. The part that would make everything else necessary was over. What came next was not revenge. What came next was the truth. And the truth had already been making its way to the lobby entrance for the past 40 minutes in the form of 10 black SUVs that were at this exact moment pulling silently into position on the street below. The lobby security desk logged him out at 11:47 a.m. At 11:53 a.m., the first SUV turned the corner, and the city, or at least one building in it, would never be exactly the same again. If you're still reading this, drop your city below. I want to see every single place this story reaches. And if you believe a man's value has nothing to do with his jacket, you already know what to do. The lobby of Harrington International had a particular kind of silence after Caleb Thompson walked out of it. Not the silence of a room that had gone quiet. The silence of a room that was holding its breath. The security desk officer, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who had worked the front entrance for 11 years, watched the doors close behind the man in the faded jacket and felt something he couldn't immediately name. He had seen hundreds of people escorted out of this building over the years. Layoffs, firings, security removals. He had seen people cry at that door. He had seen people shout. He had seen a man once throw his employee badge at the marble floor with enough force to crack it. He had never seen anyone walk out the way Caleb Thompson just had. No performance, no protest, no backward glance searching for someone to witness his dignity. Just a man who walked like he already knew where he was going. Gerald turned back to his monitors. And that's when he saw the first one. On the exterior camera, the wide-angle feed that covered the main entrance approach and the first 50 yards of the street, a black SUV turned the corner at the far end of the block. Gerald leaned forward slightly. Then a second one followed. Then a third. By the time the fourth appeared, Gerald had already picked up his radio. "Front desk to building security," he said. "We've got a convoy incoming. Main entrance approach. I'm counting." He paused, watching the screen. "I'm counting 8 vehicles. No 9. 10. There was a brief silence on the other end. "What kind of vehicles?" "Black SUVs. Professional. Private plates." Another silence. "Gerald, are you sure?" He watched the convoy slow to a precise coordinated stop along the front of the building, not the chaotic stopping of vehicles that arrive independently, but the deliberate, rehearsed positioning of a security operation that had planned this approach down to the foot. "I'm sure," Gerald said. He set down the radio and stood up from his chair for the first time in 3 hours. Outside, Caleb Thompson was standing on the sidewalk, and he was waiting. On the 4th floor, nobody had gone back to work. This was not a conscious decision any individual made. It was more like a collective failure of will. The way a crowd at an accident scene can't quite make themselves look away, even when they know they should. What had just happened on the floor didn't feel finished. It felt like the first act of something that hadn't resolved yet, and every person in that room could feel it without being able to articulate why. Derek was standing near the window. He didn't know why he'd walked to the window. His desk was nowhere near it. But something in the last 20 minutes had moved him there without his fully deciding to go, and now he was looking down at the street 6 stories below, and he was seeing something that made no immediate sense to him. "Hey," he said quietly. Nobody looked up. "Hey," he said again louder. 3 people looked up. "There, come here. Come look at this." One by one, people left their desks and came to the windows. There were 6 of them. At first, then 12, then more, all of them crowding toward the glass, with the particular urgency of people who understand instinctively that whatever is happening outside is connected to whatever just happened inside. They watched 10 black SUVs pull to a stop on the street below. They watched the doors open. They watched men and women in suits step out, not company suits, not the kind of suit that belonged to a mid-level executive at a regional meeting, but the kind of suit that cost more than most of their monthly salaries, the kind that announced itself without trying to. And then they watched someone else step out. An older man, 70, maybe older, white-haired, the kind of face that appeared in history books and annual reports and framed photographs in executive conference rooms. Derek recognized him first. He actually stepped back from the window. "Is that?" he started. "Richard Coleman," said a woman named Priya, who had been at Harrington long enough to have once stood in the same elevator as the man. The name went through the group like an electric current. Richard Coleman, the founder. The man whose vision had built the company they were all standing in. The man who had, as far as anyone knew, been largely retired for years, present at board meetings, visible at major company events, but absent from daily operations, in the way that legends tend to be absent everywhere in spirit, nowhere in particular. "Why is Richard Coleman?" Derek started again. But nobody had the answer to that question yet, because the answer was still unfolding 7 floors below them on the sidewalk, where Richard Coleman had just walked directly past the building's main entrance, past the gathered assistants and security personnel, who had rushed out to meet him, past every person who had positioned themselves to receive him, and was walking toward the man in the faded jacket. Caleb heard the footsteps before he turned. He knew the rhythm of them. He'd known Richard Coleman's walk for more than 20 years. That deliberate pace that was not slow, but was never rushed, the walk of a man who had decided a long time ago that the world could wait for him as often as he'd waited for it. He turned. Richard was 6 feet away, and the look on his face was something Caleb had not expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, something closer to pain. "Caleb," Richard said. Just his name. Nothing else for a moment. Then the older man closed the remaining distance between them, and he did something that made every person watching from inside the building go completely still. He stopped directly in front of Caleb, and he bowed his head. Not a nod, not a brief dip of acknowledgement. A full, deliberate lowering of his head, the way you bow to someone when words are not sufficient, when the gesture needs to carry the weight that language can't hold. "I'm sorry, sir," Richard said. His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "I should have been paying closer attention. This should not have happened." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You drove 3 hours for this, Richard?" "4," Richard said, lifting his head. "There was construction on 95. Caleb almost smiled. "You didn't have to come." "Yes," Richard said with the quiet certainty of someone who had been making decisions for 70 years and knew when one was non-negotiable. "I did." He reached out and put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, the gesture of a man who was not demonstrative by nature, but who was making an exception because the moment demanded it. "Come inside," Richard said. "Richard?" "Not a request, Caleb." Caleb looked at the building. He thought about the 4 weeks he had spent inside it. The vendor archive. The notebook with its 6 pages of findings. The moment Amanda Pierce had said those 8 words, and Victoria Harrington had looked at his jacket and made the decision that ended with him standing on the sidewalk. He thought about every person still on the 4th floor who had been sent to corners and assigned to disappearing work because someone had looked at them and made a decision before hearing a word. "All right," he said. And together the billionaire who had entered the building as nobody and the founder who had driven 4 hours to find him, they walked back toward the entrance. The 2 security personnel standing at the door stepped aside so quickly it was almost choreographed. Gerald, watching from the desk, didn't say a word. He just watched them pass. And then he sat back down at his monitor, and in the remarks field of the security log under the 11:53 a.m. entry, he typed 4 words. Something big just happened. The news reached the 4th floor in fragments, the way news always travels inside a building, incomplete and out of order, and growing with each retelling. First, Richard Coleman was in the building. Second, he had come specifically to see the man who had just been fired. Third, he had, and this was the part that people couldn't quite process on first hearing, bowed his head to the man in the faded jacket. Derek heard the third part from Priya, who had heard it from someone on the 2nd floor, who had witnessed it directly through the lobby windows. He sat down slowly at his desk. His mind kept returning to the interactions he'd had with Caleb over the past month. The way Caleb had answered his questions with a completeness that always stopped just short of saying too much. The way he had sat with the archive work without complaining, without appearing defeated, without the low-grade misery that settled into the posture of most people who got assigned to tasks they considered beneath them. He thought about the day he'd stood at Caleb's desk and asked, essentially, "Why are you here?" and how Caleb had said, "Maybe for some people," and then said nothing else. He thought about the moment 30 minutes ago when Victoria had said, "You're done," and Caleb had looked at her with an expression that Derek had initially read as resignation. He understood now that he had misread it entirely. That expression was not resignation. It was patience. It was the expression of someone who already knew how the story ended and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. "What does this mean?" said a woman named Cynthia from the desk beside him. She was 26, had been at Harrington for 8 months, and was looking at Derek with an expression that wanted someone older to explain the world to her. "I don't know exactly," Derek said, "but you have an idea." He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, that we just made a very significant mistake. Cynthia looked back toward the elevator. We didn't do anything, she said. Amanda did. Victoria did. Amanda and Victoria work here, Derek said. And none of us said a word. The silence that followed that statement was a different kind than the one after Caleb walked out. This one had weight in it. On the executive floor, Victoria Harrington was standing at the window of her office. She had come up here after returning from the 4th floor, which was something she rarely did in the middle of a workday. Her office was for strategy for calls for the controlled environment of high-stakes decision-making. She didn't retreat here to think she came here to execute, but right now she was standing at the window. She had watched the convoy arrive from above, the way you watch a thunderstorm coming in from a distance, aware that it's moving toward you, unable to fully believe the scale of it until it's already overhead. She had recognized Richard Coleman immediately. She had watched him walk past the entrance and move toward the man on the sidewalk, and she had watched the moment when Richard lowered his head, and she had stood very still at her window for a long time after that. Her assistant, a sharp and perceptive young woman named Kelsey, had come in twice. The first time Victoria had dismissed her with a single gesture. The second time, Kelsey had come in and simply said, "They're on their way up." Victoria hadn't turned from the window. "Who is he?" she asked. Kelsey was quiet for a fraction too long. "Kelsey, I've been trying to find out," Kelsey said. "The name Caleb Thompson pulls up limited public records. He went through the standard hiring process. Application background check, HR interview with Amanda." But I called the legal department," Kelsey said, "and they wouldn't tell me anything. They said to refer any questions about Caleb Thompson to the board's counsel." The board's counsel. Victoria finally turned from the window. "The board's counsel," she repeated. "Yes, not our legal department, the board's." "Yes." Victoria absorbed this. She was a brilliant strategist that was not in question, had never been in question. She could read the architecture of a corporate situation the way other people read facial expressions instinctively and quickly and almost always correctly. She was reading this one now, and the picture that was forming was one that she did not want to look at directly. "Get me Amanda," she said. Amanda Pierce had been expecting the call. She arrived at Victoria's office within 4 minutes, which meant she had been close by, probably waiting, probably running the same calculations that Victoria was running, and arriving at the same terrible answers. She closed the door behind her. Victoria looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Amanda was good at managing silence. It was one of her professional skills. She had used silence as a tool in HR settings for years, understood how to let it stretch until the other person couldn't bear it anymore, and filled it with things they hadn't planned to say. But this was Victoria's office, and the silence was Victoria's. "Tell me exactly what you know about him," Victoria said. "I reviewed his file again after you." Amanda paused. "After this morning, standard background check cleared, no red flags, Howard undergrad, Chicago, MBA. Previous employer was a small logistics consulting firm." "What firm?" "Meridian Group Consulting." Victoria picked up her phone and typed something into it. She looked at the result. Then she looked at Amanda. "Meridian Group Consulting," she said. "Delaware registered LLC. Principal officer listed as..." She turned the phone so Amanda could see the screen. On the screen was a registration document, and in the field marked Principal Officer C. A. Thompson. Amanda stared at it. "That doesn't necessarily mean Amanda." Victoria's voice was very quiet. "Stop." Amanda stopped. "Who is he?" Victoria asked. Not rhetorically this time, with the specific urgency of someone who needs information and needs it immediately. Before Amanda could form an answer, the office door opened. Kelsey appeared in the doorway. Her expression was the expression of someone delivering news they would rather not be delivering. "He's here," she said. "Richard Coleman is here. He's in the main conference room on 12. She paused. "He's asking for you." Victoria was very still. "Is Thompson with him?" "Yes." She looked at Amanda one more time. And in that look was something Amanda had never seen from Victoria Harrington in 4 years of working closely with her. Fear, not panic, not desperation, just the clean, clear fear of someone who is very good at their job and has just realized with absolute certainty that they have made a mistake so significant that their competence may not be sufficient to address it. "Go back to your office," Victoria told Amanda. "Don't talk to anyone." Amanda nodded and left. Victoria straightened her jacket. She had walked into rooms where she held every advantage and rooms where she held almost none, and she had learned over the years to look the same in both. To keep her face from broadcasting the internal calculation, to carry her posture with the same deliberate confidence, regardless of what she knew or didn't know. She walked to the door. Then she stopped. She turned back to her desk. She opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a framed photograph she kept there rather than on the surface of her desk. A habit she'd always explained to herself as professional minimalism, never wanting the personal to intrude on the workspace. The photograph was of the day Harrington International had gone public. The ringing of the bell, the gathered team, the cameras. The moment the company she had been trusted to lead had announced itself to the world in the most definitive way a company can. She had been so proud that day. She stood there looking at the photograph for several seconds. Then she closed the drawer and walked out of her office toward the elevator that would take her to the 12th floor. The main conference room on 12 had glass walls on 2 sides, which meant that the executives gathered in the hallway outside it, and there were many of them now drawn by the same gravitational pull of impending significance that had emptied the 4th floor of productive work could see what was happening inside without being able to hear a word. What they could see was this: Richard Coleman sat at the head of the table. To his right sat Caleb Thompson, who had not changed his jacket, who was still carrying the notebook he'd picked up from his desk on the way out, who looked exactly as he had looked every day for the past month, unhurried and quiet, and completely himself. Around the table were 4 other people, 2 men and a woman from Richard's legal team, and a 4th individual that several of the watching executives recognized as the company's primary outside counsel. The watching executives exchanged looks. None of them spoke, because outside counsel didn't come to a building in 30 minutes without having been prepared well in advance, and no one called outside counsel into a conference room over the firing of an operations associate, unless the operations associate was not what anyone had believed him to be. The elevator at the end of the hall opened. Victoria Harrington stepped out. She walked down the hall with that measured authoritative pace, and people who had gathered there moved out of her path the way they always did. But this time, 1 or 2 of them didn't quite move fast enough, and she noticed. She opened the conference room door. The room changed when she entered it. Not in a dramatic way. There was no shift in expression on anyone's face, no theatrical pause in a conversation. But she felt it the way you feel the difference in air pressure between 2 rooms, even before you consciously process that one of them has a window open. She had walked into countless rooms that shifted around her. She had always been the reason for the shift. She took her usual chair halfway down the table. The power position for someone running a meeting, but not chairing it, and she opened her mouth to speak. Richard Coleman spoke first. "Victoria," he said. "Thank you for coming." She nodded. "Richard." She looked across the table. "Mr. Thompson." Caleb met her eyes directly. He nodded once. "I think," Victoria said, "that someone needs to explain to me what is happening." "That's fair," Richard said. He folded his hands on the table. "I should have done this differently. I should have made sure this was not possible." He glanced at Caleb. "Caleb, do you want to take this?" Caleb looked at Victoria for a long moment. She held his gaze, and she found with a discomfort she did not allow to show on her face that his gaze was not what she expected. She expected anger. She expected the barely contained satisfaction of a person who has been wronged and has arrived at the moment of reckoning. What she found instead was something that had no hostility in it at all, just attention. The focused, complete attention of someone who sees you, not your position, not your power, not the office on the top floor, or the decisions you've made, or the title on your business card. Someone who sees the person inside all of that and is waiting to find out who that person actually is. It was the most unsettling thing she had experienced in a professional setting in years. "Victoria," Caleb said. "My full name is Caleb Aaron Thompson. I'm the majority shareholder of Harrington International. I hold 63% of the company's equity, which I've maintained through a trust structure since the company was reorganized 12 years ago." He paused. "I built this company. Richard was my mentor, my original investor, and has been a board member since the beginning." He stopped there. Not because the story was finished, there was obviously more, but because he understood that this was the exact amount of information she needed right now. Everything else could come after she had had a moment to process the foundation of it. Victoria did not move for several seconds. She was doing what brilliant people do when they receive information that reorganizes everything they thought they knew. She was running backward through every interaction, every decision, every assumption, finding all the places where the new information changed the meaning of what she remembered. It took her by Caleb's count about 8 seconds. Then she said in a voice that was admirably controlled, "You've been here for a month." 31 days, Caleb said. "As an operations associate." "Vendor archive mostly. Amanda reassigned me after the second week." Victoria absorbed this. "Why?" she asked. And the question was not why did Amanda reassign you? She understood that part. The question was, why did you come here at all? Why did you do this? "Because I'd been hearing things," Caleb said. "From people outside the company, people who had worked here or tried to, and what they were telling me didn't match the company I built." He opened the notebook on the table, not aggressively, just placing it there between them. "I needed to know if what they were saying was true," he said. "And I knew that if I walked in here as myself, every single person in this building would show me their best face. I would see the company the way it performs, not the way it actually functions." "So you came as nobody," Victoria said. "I came as someone who didn't have the protection of a name," Caleb said, "which is how most people come to work every day." The room was very quiet. "And what did you find?" Victoria asked. She was asking with the professionalism of someone conducting a debrief, keeping her voice level, her hands still on the table, her face arranged in the deliberate neutrality of a person who understands that showing emotion right now is not strategic. But her eyes were different. Caleb saw it. He had always been able to see the thing behind the performance in people, in companies, in the numbers, underneath the numbers. It was the ability that had made him exceptional at building things, and it was the same ability, he understood, that had sometimes made him hard to work for, because he saw things people weren't ready to have seen. "I found a company that has forgotten why it was built," he said. "Not in its products, not in its market position, those things are still strong, but in how it treats people who don't have power." He looked at her. "I found a company where someone like me, without a name, without a title, without the right jacket, gets sent to the corner and given work designed to make them disappear. And nobody pushes back. Nobody asks why. Because the system rewards people who look a certain way and move in a certain direction, and everyone else gets filtered out before anyone ever discovers what they can actually do." He closed the notebook. "I found a company," he said, "that looks at people and sees categories, not people." Victoria was very still. "You found one instance," she said. "It was not a defense. It was a probe she was testing whether the evidence was larger than herself and Amanda." "I found 31 days of documented instances," Caleb said. "Amanda Pierce, 4 separate employees she managed. I spoke with them over the course of the month, not identifying myself, just talking the way coworkers talk. I have their accounts. I also found financial irregularities in the vendor archive that suggest a culture of non-accountability that goes beyond any one person's decisions." He paused. "But I also want to be clear about something." He looked at her steadily. "This is not about you specifically, Victoria. You are a brilliant operator. You are exactly the kind of strategist this company needed at the level it was at when I stepped back. The problem is not your intelligence. The problem is what your intelligence has been pointed at." She said nothing. You have been optimizing for outcomes, he said. Revenue, market position, product development cycles, and you have produced results. Genuinely impressive results. He stopped. But you have been so focused on the metrics you could measure that you stopped asking about the ones you couldn't. You stopped asking what this company costs the people inside it, not in salary, in dignity. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Victoria's jaw moved slightly, a small, barely visible adjustment. That's a significant accusation, she said. It's not an accusation, Caleb said. It's an observation. An accusation says you're a bad person. An observation says something went wrong and we need to understand why. He paused. I don't think you're a bad person, Victoria. I watched you run this company from the inside for a month. You work harder than almost anyone in this building. You make difficult decisions quickly. You keep this company moving forward. She waited. But leadership isn't only about moving forward, he said. It's about who you're moving forward with and who you're leaving behind. The conference room was so quiet, you could hear the ventilation system. Outside the glass walls, the gathered executives in the hallway couldn't hear any of this. But they could see it. They could see Victoria Harrington, the CEO, the woman who had run this company with an iron calendar and a brilliant mind, the woman who had never visibly flinched in a professional setting, in any of their combined memories, sitting at that table with something in her posture that none of them had ever seen. She wasn't broken. She wasn't humiliated. But she was, for the first time in any of their experience of her, genuinely uncertain. And the man across from her, the one who had spent a month in the building being ignored and reassigned, and finally fired in front of 200 people, was not making her feel that way, with anger or power or the threat of consequence. He was making her feel it with the simple, unmovable weight of truth. Richard Coleman had been watching all of this in silence. He spoke now quietly. Caleb, he said, I think we should talk next steps. Caleb nodded. He looked at Victoria one more time. I'm not here to destroy anything, he said. I'm here because the company I spent 12 years building was becoming something I didn't recognize, and I believed it could find its way back. He held her gaze, but that requires honesty about where it lost the path. Victoria looked down at the table. For the first time in the meeting, she looked away from him, and when she looked back, something in her expression had shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, in the way that certain things open when the wall they've been leaning against is quietly removed. What happens now? She said. It was, Caleb noted, the first question she had asked. That was not a probe or a defense. It was just a question. Now, he said, we find out what this company is actually made of. He picked up the notebook. He placed his hand flat on the table between them. And that starts with a conversation I should have had 4 years ago, he said. Before I let myself believe that stepping back was the same as stepping away. Outside on the street below, the 10 black SUVs still sat in perfect formation. And on the 4th floor, Derek stood at the window and looked down at them and thought about the man who had sat 3 desks away from him for a month, writing in a notebook, answering every question with exactly as many words as the question required, never once performing urgency or fear or ambition. He thought about how many people in his life he had assessed in the first 10 seconds. He thought about how many times he had been right. And for the first time in a long time, Derek was not sure the number was as high as he'd always assumed. Inside the conference room on 12, Caleb Thompson opened his notebook to the first page. And the real conversation began. The notebook had 43 pages of handwritten notes. Caleb didn't open it dramatically. He didn't flip to a specific page with the practiced efficiency of someone making a courtroom argument. He simply opened it to the beginning, placed it flat on the table between himself and Victoria, and let her look at the first page. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. The handwriting was dense but organized, not the frantic scrawl of someone documenting grievances in the heat of emotion, but the measured, systematic notation of someone who had been trained to observe before, concluding to record before judging. Dates on the left margin. Names in the center. Specific incidents described in the economical language of someone who understood that the most damaging facts needed no decoration. Victoria read the first page. Then she turned to the second. Nobody in the room spoke. Richard Coleman watched her read with the expression of a man who has already read the document and is now watching someone else encounter it for the first time, carrying the particular weight of knowing what's coming on the next page. On the third page, Victoria stopped. She placed her finger on a specific line and looked up at Caleb. "This is about Grace Whitfield," she said. "Yes. She left the company voluntarily. I remember the exit interview notes. She said she'd received a better offer." "She told the exit interviewer what she knew they wanted to hear," Caleb said. "What she told me when we talked in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon in my second week was different." Victoria held his gaze. "And what did she tell you?" "She told me she'd applied for the senior project manager position in product development. She was the most qualified internal candidate by every measurable standard. 10-year performance reviews project completion rates. She had also completed an external certification in the area, the position required on her own time at her own expense." Caleb paused. She was told the position required someone with a different kind of leadership presence. He let that phrase sit in the air for a moment. "Leadership presence," Victoria said. "That's what Amanda told her, in writing in a follow-up email that Grace kept. The silence that followed was the silence of a room absorbing a specific kind of evidence, not the abstract evidence of a systemic problem, but the concrete, dated, signed evidence of a moment in which a real person was told in corporate language that everyone in that room understood perfectly well, that she was not the right kind of person for the kind of stage they were building." "I didn't authorize that language," Victoria said. "No," Caleb agreed. "You didn't have to." She looked at him. "Explain what you mean by that," she said. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger, not defensiveness, but the beginning of something harder to manage than either. The beginning of genuine reckoning. "You set the culture," Caleb said. "Not through memos, not through policy documents. Through what you rewarded and what you didn't notice. Through who made it onto your radar and who didn't." He turned to the 5th page of the notebook. "In my 31 days at this company, I tracked the employees who were publicly acknowledged in all-hands messages, in department-wide emails, in the internal recognition system. I also tracked from the archive and from conversations the employees who were quietly moved to less visible roles or encouraged toward exits over the past 2 years." He turned the notebook so she could see the 2 columns he'd drawn on that page. She looked at them. He didn't need to explain what the pattern showed. It was visible without interpretation. "You didn't create this on purpose," Caleb said. "That's what makes it complicated. Intentional bias is easier to address because there's a clear decision point, a clear decision maker, a clear moment where someone chose wrong. But what happened here was something more insidious than intention." "What was it?" she asked. "Comfort," he said simply. "The people who got promoted, who got acknowledged, who got access to the opportunities this company offers. They looked familiar to the people making the decisions. They talked in a way that resonated. They moved in a way that felt like leadership to the people defining what leadership looks like. And every time someone different came through, different background, different style, different way of holding themselves in a room, there was a moment of discomfort. And that discomfort got translated into a performance evaluation, or a cultural fit assessment, or a conversation about leadership presence, and the different person left." Victoria was very still. "And the company got more and more populated," Caleb continued, "with people who looked and sounded like the people who were already in positions of power. And the products they built reflected that, and the culture they created reflected that. And eventually..." He paused. "Eventually, you end up with a company that is by certain metrics extremely successful, and by other metrics profoundly hollow." The word hollow moved through the room like something physical. Victoria looked down at the table, and Caleb watched her do something he had not seen her do in the conference room yet. She released a breath. Long and slow, and entirely unself-conscious, the breath of someone who has been holding something together by will alone. and has just in this one small and private moment stopped. She didn't speak for a long time. When she did, she didn't ask about the notebook or about Grace Whitfield or about any of the specific incidents on any of the 43 pages. She asked, "Did you ever consider just calling me?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Before I came, yes. And I decided that if I called you, I would get the version of you that talks to shareholders," he said. "I needed to see the version of you that runs the company." "Are they different?" "Every person has a version of themselves that appears when they think someone important is watching," Caleb said, "and a different version that appears when they think no one important is watching. The second version is always more accurate." Victoria absorbed this. "And what version did you see?" she asked. He considered his answer carefully. "I saw a version of you that is genuinely committed to this company's success," he said. "I saw someone who works with an intensity that most people in this building can't match. I saw someone who cares about outcomes, real outcomes, not just optics." He paused. "I also saw someone who has been so focused on winning that she stopped asking what winning costs." Victoria looked at him. "That's a kind way of saying something unkind," she said. "It's an accurate way of saying something true," Caleb replied. Richard Coleman made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but something in that direction. He had known both of these people for a long time, and he was watching them talk to each other with the focused attention of a man who understood that what was happening in this room was more significant than it appeared. "Richard," Victoria said without taking her eyes off Caleb, "what does the board want from this?" "The board," Richard said carefully, "has not yet met formally. What I can tell you is that I have spoken with 3 members individually, and the consensus is that they want to understand what happened before they decide what comes next." "That's diplomatic," Victoria said. "It's accurate," Richard said. "Nobody on the board is celebrating this situation, including Caleb." Victoria finally looked at Richard. "They want a review," she said. It was not a question. "They want an independent investigation of hiring and promotion practices over the past 3 years," Richard said. "Third-party firm. Full access. Complete report submitted to the full board." Victoria didn't blink. "And while the investigation is ongoing, operations continue as normal," Richard said. "You continue as CEO. You have not been removed. You have not been suspended. Nothing public has been said, and nothing public will be said while the process is underway." He paused. "That was Caleb's condition." Victoria looked at Caleb. "That was your condition," she said slowly. "Yes." "Why?" "Because destroying the company to make a point about how the company was failing its people would be the most counterproductive thing I could do," Caleb said. "The people on that 4th floor, the ones who've been here for years, the ones who are building good things in spite of the culture problems, they didn't fire me. And they shouldn't pay for the decisions of the people who did." She was very quiet. "You're protecting the company," she said. "I'm protecting the people in it," he said. "Which is the same thing if you're doing it right." The investigation took 11 weeks. The firm Richard brought in a specialized corporate culture consultancy out of Chicago that had done this kind of work for 7 Fortune 500 companies arrived the following Monday with a team of 8 people and a methodology that began with anonymous surveys and ended with direct interviews of 312 current employees. During those 11 weeks, Caleb came back to the building. Not to the 4th floor, not to the executive level. He set up in a small office on the 8th floor that had been used as a secondary storage space, which required moving about 40 boxes of obsolete marketing materials, which he did himself on the first morning with the help of Gerald from the security desk, who had appeared at his side without being asked, and begun carrying boxes without a word in the manner of a man who had decided some time ago that he owed this person something, even if he couldn't fully articulate why. Every morning for 11 weeks, Caleb arrived at 7:30 a.m. He read reports. He took meetings with the investigation team. He reviewed documentation and financial records, and the employment histories of people who had left the company over the past 3 years. He also 3 times a week walked the floors, not as a shareholder, not announced. He walked them the way he had walked them as an operations associate, slowly paying attention, stopping to talk to people, asking specific questions about specific parts of their work, and listening to the answers with the full unhurried focus that people so rarely receive from anyone with power that they sometimes became visibly uncertain how to respond to it. He talked to a man named James on the tech development floor who had been with the company for 6 years and who had submitted the same internal proposal for a product improvement 3 times over 18 months and received no response to any of the 3 submissions. When Caleb asked him what the proposal was about, James described it in 14 minutes with the barely contained energy of someone who has been waiting a very long time for someone to simply ask. The proposal was excellent. Caleb told him so. James looked at him with an expression that was complicated, grateful, and skeptical. In equal measure, the expression of someone who has received compliments from people in power before and has learned to wait and see if the compliment is connected to anything real. "I'll be following up on this," Caleb told him. "With respect," James said carefully. "I've heard that before." "I know," Caleb said, "which is why I'm going to give you my direct contact information, and I want you to email me the proposal by end of this week, and I want you to follow up with me in 2 weeks if you haven't heard back." James was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not a suspicious one. He wasn't asking, "What's your angle?" He was asking with the earnest bewilderment of someone who has been operating inside a system for so long that genuine interest from above feels fundamentally unfamiliar. "Because your idea is good, and this company should be using it," Caleb said. "And because you've been here 6 years and nobody has answered your emails, and that is a failure I want to correct." James nodded slowly. He still looked uncertain. But 3 days later, Caleb received the email. On the 23rd day of the investigation, Amanda Pierce was called in for her first formal interview with the consultancy team. She came prepared. You could see it in the way she carried herself down the hallway toward the conference room they'd commandeered on the 9th floor, the way someone looks when they've rehearsed, when they've thought through the likely questions and prepared the likely answers, and organized their narrative around the specific shape they want it to take. She was in that interview for 3 hours and 40 minutes. When she came out, her face was different. Not collapsed. Amanda Pierce was not someone who collapsed. But there was a quality to her expression that people who saw her in the hallway afterward struggled to name precisely a kind of erosion around the edges of the confident management professional face she had maintained for so many years that most people had stopped noticing it was a face at all. What the interview team had done, which she had not fully anticipated despite her preparation, was show her documents. Her own emails, her own calendar records, her own notes from the HR system. And then, without accusing her of anything, they had simply asked her to explain the patterns they revealed. The gap between Grace Whitfield's qualifications and the person who received the promotion Grace had applied for. The language used in the assessments of 3 specific employees who had all been placed on performance improvement plans within 6 months of their hire employees, who on paper had stronger credentials than the employees who had been hired into similar roles and promoted. The specific phrases that appeared repeatedly in evaluations of employees who did not progress, phrases like "needs to develop executive presence" and "not quite the right cultural fit," and would benefit from more professional polish, and the demographic distribution of the employees to whom those phrases were most frequently applied. Amanda had answers to all of these, but the answers, as the interview team gently noted, were general, where the documents were specific. They were about process, where the documents were about individual decisions. They were about policy, where the documents were about outcomes. By the end of the interview, Amanda Pierce had given the most technically comprehensive account of her management philosophy she had ever provided, and she had explained almost nothing. She walked past Caleb's office on the way back to her own. His door was open. She stopped. He was at his desk reading something, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. They looked at each other for a moment. "Amanda," he said. She had not spoken to him directly since the morning she had told Victoria that he didn't fit the image of the company. That was the last exchange between them, those 8 words, and then his departure, and then the convoy, and then everything that followed. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said. She looked like she was going to say several things and was choosing between them, editing in real time, discarding versions of the sentence that felt inadequate. "I didn't know who you were," she said finally. It was the version she'd chosen. He understood immediately why it was technically true, and it also functioned as both an explanation and a partial defense, the kind of statement that does 2 jobs at once. "I know that," he said. "If I had known." "Amanda," he said, quietly, not harshly. "That's the problem." She stopped. "The fact that you didn't know who I was should not have changed anything about how you treated me," he said. "That's the whole point, not of my being here specifically, of everything." He put down what he'd been reading. "The question isn't what you would have done if you'd known my name. The question is what you did when you didn't." Amanda stood in the doorway. She was a smart woman. She was professionally accomplished. She had spent 20 years building a career in human resources with the genuine belief Caleb suspected that she was good at understanding people. And now she was standing in the doorway of a storage room turned office, looking at the man she had sent to the vendor archive and understanding, with the irreversible clarity of a moment that cannot be unseen, that she had spent 20 years confusing familiarity with fairness. "I can't undo it," she said. "No," he agreed. "What do you want from me?" He leaned back in his chair and looked at her steadily. "I want you to be honest in that interview room," he said. "Not careful, not strategic. Honest. Because the only way anything changes is if the people responsible for the system tell the truth about how the system actually worked." She was silent for a long moment. "And if I do that," she said, "what happens to me?" "I don't know," he said. She looked at him. "That's not a reassuring answer," she said. "It's an honest one," he replied. Amanda Pierce stood in his doorway for another few seconds. Then she straightened slightly, that professional reflex, the spine going to its habitual position of managed composure, and she nodded once. And she walked away. He watched her go. He picked up his reading again, but he didn't look at it for a long moment, because he was thinking about what she'd asked. "What do you want from me?" And about his answer, and about whether honesty was enough, whether honesty was ever enough, whether a system that had been running in one direction for years could be turned by the willingness of the people inside it to name what it was. He thought about Diane. She had always been the one who believed that people could change. Not easily, not without cost, but genuinely in ways that mattered. She had held that belief with a steadiness that had sometimes frustrated him, not because he disagreed with it philosophically, but because he'd seen too many instances where the belief was not rewarded. "The ones who don't change," she'd told him once, "are the ones who were never really asked to, not by someone who believed they could, just by consequences." He thought about that now in the context of Amanda Pierce and her walk down the hallway. He wasn't sure yet which category she belonged to, but he was willing to find out. Victoria Harrington had been conducting herself with the precision of someone walking a very narrow path over a very long distance. She had continued doing her job. She had shown up at every meeting, answered every email, made every decision that needed to be made. She had not spoken publicly about the investigation. She had not told the executive team more than they needed to know. She had maintained the surface of normal operations with the same controlled competence that had characterized her leadership for years. But something was different. The people who worked most closely with her noticed it in small ways. Kelsey noticed it first. She noticed it in the way Victoria had started leaving her office door open. In the afternoons, a minor change, almost invisible, but significant, because Victoria's office door had been closed as a default since the first week Kelsey worked for her. Closed doors in Victoria's world meant focused work. Important calls, the serious business of running a company. An open door meant something else. It meant in some small way available. Elaine, the project lead from the 4th floor, who had looked away during the confrontation, noticed it in a meeting when Victoria asked her directly what she thought of a strategic proposal, not in the rhetorical way of a leader inviting the performance of agreement, but in the specific expecting an actual answer way of someone who has decided that the room contains perspectives worth hearing. Elaine, caught off guard, had given her actual opinion. Victoria had adjusted the proposal based on it. Neither of them mentioned this afterward, but both of them felt it. The change was not dramatic. It was not the kind of transformation that announces itself. It was the kind that happens in the way tectonic plates move imperceptibly, incrementally, and beneath the surface, until one day, the ground looks slightly different than it used to, and you're not entirely sure when the shift occurred. What Victoria was doing in the 11 weeks of the investigation was thinking, not strategizing, not positioning, not calculating the optimal outcome for herself and the company. Thinking. About the question Caleb had asked her, not the formal questions in the conference room, but the one he'd asked with his presence, with the fact of his being there with 31 days of showing up in a faded jacket and doing the work nobody wanted to do. The question was, who are you when nobody important is watching? She had always believed she knew the answer to that question. She was learning that she had been answering a slightly different question. She had known who she was when she believed she was doing the right thing, but she had not examined with sufficient honesty how she determined what the right thing was. She pulled Grace Whitfield's file one evening after everyone else had gone home. She read through it with the kind of attention she rarely gave to individual HR files, which were usually reviewed in bulk and summarized rather than read directly. She read Grace's original application, her performance reviews, her project records. She read the internal communications around the promotion she had applied for. She read the email from Amanda that said leadership presence. Then she read the file of the person who had received the promotion instead. She sat with both files open on her desk for a long time. She had not made that promotion decision herself. It had come to her as a done deal, a recommendation from Amanda that she had approved with the absent rubber stamp of an executive who trusted her HR director and was managing 47 other things simultaneously. But the approval had been hers. The signature on the memo was hers. And she understood now with a clarity that was genuinely painful that her signature on a document she hadn't fully examined was not the same as non-involvement. That leadership meant owning outcomes you'd delegated as fully as outcomes you'd directed. That the abdication of attention was its own kind of decision. She closed both files. She opened her email. She typed a message to the investigation team requesting that Grace Whitfield be contacted not as part of the formal interview process, but as someone the company owed a direct conversation to. She sent it at 11:47 p.m. Then she sat in her office alone for a while. The investigation report was delivered on a Thursday morning. It was 214 pages long. The summary which the consultancy team presented to Caleb Richard and 2 board members in a 4-hour session contained findings that were detailed, documented, and unflinching. Over a 3-year period, the promotion rate for employees from underrepresented backgrounds was 41% lower than for employees with similar performance reviews from majority demographics. The disparity was most pronounced in roles above the mid-management level. The attrition rate for employees who had been placed on performance improvement plans showed a demographic skew that could not be explained by performance data alone. Language analysis of HR communications revealed recurring subjective phrases, presence, polish, fit, energy, applied with a statistical consistency that demonstrated pattern rather than coincidence. 22 former employees had left the company in the past 3 years, citing reasons that upon direct interview correlated with experiences of being undervalued or unfairly assessed. The report also noted in a section Caleb read twice that the majority of the employees and managers interviewed expressed genuine commitment to the company's stated values of inclusivity and merit-based advancement. They were not, for the most part, people who consciously believed in the outcomes the investigation had revealed. They were people who had been operating inside a system that produced those outcomes without their full awareness. The distinction mattered to Caleb enormously, because a culture of malice required a different response than a culture of unawareness. Malice needed to be excised. Unawareness needed to be illuminated. And the response to illumination, the question of whether people chose to see once the light was on, was what he was most interested in now. He requested time alone with the report before the full board meeting. He sat with it in the storage room office on the 8th floor, and he read all 214 pages. When he finished, he closed it and looked out the window. He thought about Maya, who was at school right now 2 hours away drawing pictures and learning long division and existing in a world that she would one day enter as a professional, as an adult, as a person who would walk into buildings like this one and be seen or not seen. He thought about Diane and what she would have said sitting next to him reading this report. He could hear it so precisely it made his chest ache. She would have set it down on page 40, just after the first set of statistics, and said, "Caleb, what are you going to do about this?" Not as a challenge, as an expectation, as the certain knowledge that he wasn't going to just read about it. He had never been good at just reading about things. He reached for his phone and called Richard. "I've finished the report," he said. "And?" Richard's voice was careful. "It's what we thought," Caleb said. "And it's also more complicated than what we thought." "Complicated how?" "These aren't bad people," Caleb said. "Most of them. That's what makes it hard, and that's also what makes it possible to fix." "You still think it's fixable?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Richard, I built this company," he said. "Not out of money, not out of a business plan. Out of the belief that a workplace could actually be what it claims to be, a place where what you can do matters more than who you look like." He paused. "I'm not willing to write that off because it got lost for a few years. I'm willing to fight for it to be true again." Richard was silent on the other end. When he spoke, his voice was slightly rougher than usual. "Your wife would have liked hearing that," he said. Caleb looked out the window. "I know," he said. After he hung up, he sat for another few minutes. Then he opened the notebook, not the one he'd been keeping since the investigation began, but the original one, the one he'd had with him on the 4th floor, the one with 6 pages of findings he'd made in the first 2 weeks. He turned to the last page. At the bottom, on the day he'd been fired, he'd written one line. Not findings, not observations, just a single sentence, the way you write something down when it arrives in your head fully formed, and you don't want to lose it before it becomes something else. He read it now. The measure of a company is not what it achieves, but what it refuses to become. He closed the notebook. He stood up from the desk. He had a board meeting in 2 hours, and before that he had something else. Something he'd been putting off because he was not entirely sure how it was going to go, but that he understood could not be put off any longer. He picked up his phone and sent a single text message. Then he put his jacket on and walked out of the office. Down the hallway, past Gerald's security desk, Gerald raised one hand as he passed. Not a wave. Exactly, just a gesture of acknowledgement. The kind that passes between two people who have reached an understanding without ever fully articulating it. Caleb returned it. And then he took the elevator to the 12th floor, where Victoria Harrington was waiting for him. Not in the conference room this time. In her office, with the door open. Victoria was standing when he walked in, not behind her desk, not in the power position that executives instinctively assume when they know someone significant is coming. The seated authority behind the barrier of a desk, the arrangement that says, "This is my territory, and you are entering it." She was standing at the side of the room near the window, and when Caleb appeared in the open doorway, she turned and looked at him with an expression that he could not immediately categorize. It wasn't the controlled neutrality she'd worn in the conference room on 12. It wasn't the cold authority she'd carried onto the 4th floor on the morning she fired him. It was something rawer than either of those things, something that suggested the 11 weeks of the investigation had done to her what sustained pressure does to certain kinds of material not broken, but changed its composition in ways that wouldn't be visible until you looked closely. "You texted," she said. "I did," he said. "You said you wanted to talk before the board meeting." "Yes." She gestured toward the chairs near the window. Not the formal conference arrangement, not the desk and visitor chair setup, but two chairs positioned at an angle to each other, the arrangement of a conversation rather than a meeting. He sat. She sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence was different from the silences they'd shared in the conference room. Those had been tactical silences, pauses in which both parties were calculating. This one was something else. This one had the quality of two people who have been circling something important for a long time, and have finally arrived at the place where they either look at it directly or walk away. Neither of them walked away. "I read the full report," Victoria said. "So did I," Caleb said. "All 214 pages." "Yes." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "There's a section on page 112, she said, about the language patterns in performance evaluations. "I know the section. I wrote some of those evaluations," she said. "Not all of them, but some. Senior-level reviews that came through my office directly." She paused. "I used that language. Presence, energy, fit. I used it without understanding what I was actually saying with it." Caleb watched her. "I want you to understand something," she continued. "I'm not telling you this because the board meeting is in 2 hours, and I'm trying to get ahead of it. I'm telling you because I spent 3 nights this week reading my own words on those pages, and I have not been able to sleep properly since." She stopped. "I believed I was a fair person. I believed I rewarded the best people. I believed, and this is the part that is the hardest to sit with, I believed that the system I was running was the most meritocratic environment I knew how to build." She said it with the particular exhaustion of someone who has examined a belief and found it hollow at the center. "And now," Caleb asked. "And now I understand that I was confusing familiarity with merit," she said. "The same way you told me in that first meeting. I heard you say it, and I understood it intellectually." She paused. "It's different understanding something in a conference room and then seeing your own name in a 200-page document that proves it." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "Victoria," he said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." "All right." "What do you want?" he asked. "Not what you think the board wants. Not what you think is the strategically optimal answer. What do you actually want for yourself, for the people in this building, for what happens next?" She was quiet for a long time, and he let her be quiet because he had learned over many years that the answers people give when they're rushed are almost never the answers that matter, and that the answers that cost something to say are the ones that tend to be true. "I want to fix it," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than he'd heard it. "Not because my career depends on it. Not because the board is watching. Because those 22 people who left this company, I read their names in that report. I know some of those names. I remember some of those people. And they left this company carrying something that I put there without knowing I was putting it there, and I can't just file that under lessons learned and move on." Caleb looked at her. "I also want to say something to you specifically," she said. "Say it. What I did to you on that floor?" She stopped, then started again. "I stood in front of 200 people, and I fired a man based on how he looked. I told myself in the moment that it was about attitude, about comportment, about something I couldn't name, but felt I recognized. But the truth..." She stopped again. The word cost her something. "The truth is that I looked at your jacket and your backpack, and I made a decision about who you were before you'd said 10 words to me. And I have been in rooms my whole career fighting to not be judged that way. And I did it anyway. To you." The room was very still. Caleb sat with what she'd said. He had not expected this. Not this specific form of it. Not this directness. Not the particular quality of accountability that didn't come packaged with any visible agenda. He had expected professionalism. He had expected competence and strategy, and the sophisticated management of an uncomfortable situation by a person who was very good at managing uncomfortable situations. He had not expected this. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Please." "The morning I walked in here the first time," he said, "I was prepared for exactly what happened. Not the specific details. I didn't know it would be you. I didn't know what form the moment would take. But I knew, based on what I'd been hearing for months, that something like that moment was possible. I came prepared for it." He paused. "What I wasn't prepared for was how much it still cost me." Victoria looked at him. "It cost you something," she said, not skeptically, with genuine surprise. "I've been told my whole life that I don't belong in certain rooms," he said. "I've been looked at the way you looked at me, the rapid scan, the recalibration, the decision made before the conversation started more times than I can count. And I thought, after enough years of building something, of proving things, that I'd become immune to it." He was quiet for a moment. "I stood there while you said those words, and I thought about Maya, about whether the world I was leaving her was going to do that to her too. Whether all the work I'd done, all the things I'd built, had moved the needle even slightly on that question." He paused. "That's what it cost me. Not the job. Not the indignity in front of the room. The question it raised about what any of this is actually for." Victoria was very still. "I'm sorry," she said. Not the professional apology. Not the liability-conscious HR-approved expression of institutional regret. The plain, unadorned, two-word thing that a person says when they mean it, and know that it isn't enough, and say it anyway. "I know," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Caleb said, "The board meeting today is going to cover the report findings and the question of leadership going forward." "I know," she said. "The formal recommendation from 2 board members is removal," he said. She absorbed this without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction, the stillness of someone who has prepared for a blow and is receiving it. "And Richard?" she asked. "Richard's position is that the decision belongs to me," Caleb said. She looked at him. He looked back. "What is your decision?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "If I gave you the choice right now, leave with your reputation, intact, full severance, clean departure, no public statement or stay, and rebuild this company from the ground up, under a fundamentally different set of conditions, what would you choose?" Victoria understood immediately that this was not a rhetorical question. He was actually giving her the choice. Right now, in this room, before the board meeting, before the formal process, before anything was decided by anyone other than the 2 people sitting in these chairs. She understood also what the conditions of staying would mean. He hadn't spelled them out yet, but she could extrapolate from everything she knew about him, from 31 days of watching him work without complaint, and 6 pages of notebook findings, and 11 weeks of independent investigation. Staying would not mean continuing as she had been continuing. It would not mean managing the optics of change while the underlying architecture remained intact. It would mean actual change, the kind that was uncomfortable and slow and required her to sit with her own reflection in ways she had spent her whole career avoiding. She looked at him, and she thought about the open door. She thought about the evenings she'd spent this week reading the report. She thought about Grace Whitfield and the email she'd sent to the investigation team at 11:47 p.m., and the fact that reaching out to Grace directly had been the first unambiguously right thing she'd done in the context of this entire situation. She thought about the version of herself she'd believed she was for 15 years, and about the version the report had revealed, and about whether there was a third one that was possible going forward. "I want to stay," she said. "Why?" he asked. "Because leaving is easy," she said. "And I don't think I've earned easy." He held her gaze. "If you stay," he said, "you're not staying as the person you've been." "I know. The culture change that needs to happen in this company is not a communication campaign," he said. "It's not a diversity initiative with a budget line and a quarterly report. It is a fundamental renegotiation of how this company sees people. Who makes decisions? Who gets heard? Who gets access? It has to go into the structure of how we hire, how we evaluate, how we promote, how we communicate. It has to become what we actually are, not what we say we are on the website. I understand, she said. And you, he said, have to be the one who leads that. Not because you'll be the CEO doing a rebrand, but because the people in this building need to see the person who created the conditions of the problem also doing the work of solving it. That's the only version of this that means anything. Victoria was quiet. That's going to require me to be publicly accountable, she said. Yes. To the employees, not just to the board. Yes. She took a breath. Caleb, she said. When you came back in after the SUVs after Richard, you could have handled this in any way you wanted. You had every justification for a much harder response than this. I know, he said. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because I built this company to be something, he said. And the way you respond to failure is part of what a company is. If I burned it down to prove a point about how it failed, I would have made the same mistake in reverse prioritizing the demonstration over the people. He paused. The people in this building didn't fail. The leadership did. And leadership is correctable. She looked at him for a long time. Correctable, she said quietly. If the people responsible for it are willing to do the correction, he said, that's the only condition. She nodded slowly. I'm willing, she said. The board meeting lasted 4 hours. There were 7 board members present, including Richard. There was outside counsel. There were 2 representatives from the investigation firm who presented the key findings from the report and answered questions. And at the end of the presentation, after the findings had been presented and the questions had been asked, and the atmosphere in the room had settled into the particular gravity of a group of people who have just been shown something they cannot pretend they haven't seen. Caleb spoke. He spoke for 22 minutes. He didn't use slides. He didn't use the formatted executive summary the investigation firm had prepared. He used the notebook occasionally to reference specific dates or figures, but mostly he just talked the way he had talked in the early years of the company when there was no PowerPoint and no formal presentation structure, just a man with a vision trying to explain to other people why it was worth believing in. He talked about why he'd built the company. He talked about the specific belief, not the mission statement version, but the actual belief that a workplace could be a place where human beings were genuinely seen, where what you could do mattered more than what you looked like doing it, where the person who arrived in an old jacket with a repaired backpack had the same access to opportunity as the person who arrived in a tailored suit. He talked about what the investigation had found. He talked about the 22 people. He named 4 of them with their permission, which he had sought directly in the past week. He named Grace Whitfield. He named James from the tech development floor and his 18-month-old unanswered proposal. He named a man named Robert, who had been on a performance improvement plan for behaviors that in his file and in the direct interview were indistinguishable from behaviors that were described as decisive and results-oriented when exhibited by other employees. And he named a woman named Sandra, who had been with the company for 9 years and had never once been invited to present in an all-hands meeting, despite leading a team that had delivered more consistent results than any comparable team in the company. He said their names in a board meeting, out loud, which was not how these things were typically done. The board members who had come in expecting a governance conversation about liability management and leadership continuity planning sat with what he said for a long time. Then Caleb said, "The board can make whatever decision it considers appropriate regarding leadership. I'm not here to dictate that. But I am here to tell you what I believe this company needs, and I'm asking you to hear it before you vote." He looked around the table. This company doesn't need a new CEO who will run the same system with a different face, he said. It doesn't need a communication strategy that rebrands the problem as a resolved issue. What it needs is the hard, uncomfortable, unglamorous work of building a different system inside the same building. He paused. Victoria Harrington has agreed to lead that work, not as the executive running a company that has addressed its issues, as someone who is willing to stand in front of the people this company failed and say what needs to be said, and then do the work that needs to be done in public accountably, without the protection of corporate language and managed messaging. He put both hands flat on the table. That is the recommendation I'm bringing to this board, he said. Not because Victoria deserves a second chance, that's not for me to determine, but because the people in this company deserve a genuine attempt at what they were promised when they joined it. The room was quiet. Richard spoke first. I support the recommendation, he said. The vote was 5-2 in favor. The all-hands meeting happened the following Monday morning. Every floor, every department. The main auditorium, which had not been used for a full company gathering in 2 years, was at capacity, and the overflow went to 2 additional rooms with video feed. People came early, not because they'd been told something specific was happening. The communication had been deliberately minimal, just a company-wide meeting, mandatory attendance, 9 a.m. But the building had been living with the energy of the past 11 weeks, and people understood instinctively that whatever happened in that auditorium was going to be significant. Derek came early and sat near the front. He had spent the 11 weeks of the investigation doing something he hadn't done since his first month at the company, paying attention. Not to the executive dynamics and the political currents he usually tracked, but to the people around him. The ones he'd been ignoring or overlooking or assessing in the first 10 seconds and filing away. He'd had a conversation with Priya that had lasted 2 hours. He'd learned things about her work that she'd been doing for 3 years that he hadn't known. He'd gone back to a colleague he'd dismissed early in his tenure and asked genuinely what she was working on. The experience had been disorienting in a way he couldn't fully articulate, like finding out that a room you'd been walking past for years contained something extraordinary and the door had been open the whole time. Gerald took a position near the back of the auditorium, standing because that was his preference, and because from there he could see the whole room. He watched people file in. He watched the way they sat close together, quieter than usual, the particular quality of attention that appears in a crowd when people understand they are about to be told something true. At 9:03 a.m., Victoria Harrington walked onto the stage. She was not wearing charcoal gray. She was wearing a deep blue, a small thing barely noticeable, except to people who had been in this building long enough to understand that Victoria Harrington in charcoal gray was a uniform, a signal of controlled authority. The change was subtle and deliberate, and it said in the understated language of people who communicate through details that something about today was different. She stood at the center of the stage. She looked at the room. She did not look at her notes. She had them, a single page held loosely in her right hand. But she didn't look at them. 11 weeks ago, she said, something happened in this building that I need to talk to you about directly. Her voice was steady. Not the performed steadiness of someone managing an image. The steadiness of someone who has decided that something matters more than the image. I walked onto the 4th floor and I fired a man in front of all of you, she said. And the reason I gave in my own mind was attitude, comportment, something I couldn't name. But the real reason, she stopped for a half second. The real reason was that I looked at what he was wearing and I decided who he was before he'd done anything to deserve that decision. The auditorium was completely silent. That man, she said, turned out to be Caleb Thompson, the majority shareholder and founder of this company. But I need to be very clear about something because this is the most important thing I'm going to say today. The fact that he turned out to be someone powerful is not why what I did was wrong. She paused. It was wrong before I knew who he was, she said. It was wrong the moment I made the decision. The fact that he had power didn't create the wrongness, it just revealed it. In the overflow room on the 3rd floor, a woman named Sandra was watching the video feed with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She had worked at this company for 9 years and had never been invited to present at an all-hands meeting. She watched Victoria speak. She didn't unfold her arms. But she watched. I've spent the past 11 weeks reading a report about this company, Victoria continued. A report that showed me in documented, dated specific detail what this culture has been doing to people, to many of you, over the past several years. And I'm not going to stand here and describe it in abstract language about systems and structures, because the report isn't about systems and structures. It's about people. She stopped. It's about Grace. It's about Robert. It's about Sandra and James and 18 others whose names are in that report and whose experiences in this building were shaped by a culture that I led and failed to examine. Sandra uncrossed her arms. Victoria kept going. I am not going to tell you that this was all a mistake that nobody intended, she said. Intentions matter. They also don't account for everything. What matters alongside intention is outcome. And the outcomes this company produced for a significant number of its people were not acceptable. They were not what this company claims to stand for. And they were not. I now understand what many of you believed you were coming here to be part of. She looked out at the auditorium. I'm sorry, she said. And then she said it differently, not to the room in aggregate, but to specific people, to the names she'd already mentioned, looking at sections of the room, as she said, each one making the apology particular rather than general. Grace, Robert, Sandra, James. She paused between each name. I am sorry for what this company cost you. I am sorry that the potential you brought here was not met with the environment it deserved, and I am sorry that I led the organization that failed you without ever fully understanding that it was doing so. The auditorium held very still. Derek was watching the stage and thinking about a conversation he'd had with Caleb on day 3, standing at Caleb's desk, asking, how did you end up here, with the casual arrogance of someone who believed his ability to assess people in 30 seconds was a professional skill? He thought about what Caleb had said. Maybe for some people. 2 words. He hadn't understood them at the time. He understood them now. On the stage, Victoria continued. Starting today, this company is beginning a different process. Not a program, not an initiative, a process of examining how we actually function, how people are hired, how they're evaluated, how decisions about advancement are made, who makes those decisions, and what criteria they use. That process is going to take time, and it is going to be uncomfortable, and it is going to require honesty from all of us about things that are hard to be honest about. She held the page of notes at her side, still not looking at it. I am asking you to be part of that, she said, not as an audience for a company announcement, as participants in something that either becomes real because enough people in this building make it real, or doesn't become real at all. She paused. Because the one thing I've learned in the past 11 weeks is that culture is not what leadership says it is. Culture is what the people inside it do when nobody thinks it matters. She looked at the room one more time. It matters, she said. Every time. It always mattered. She stepped back from the microphone. The auditorium, 2,000 people. 11 weeks of accumulated weight, the specific charged atmosphere of a room full of people who have been waiting to hear something true, held the silence for a moment. And then it broke. Not into applause exactly. Into something more complicated. Voices movement, the sound of a room releasing something it had been holding. In the back, Gerald pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they're managing something that surprised them. In the overflow room, Sandra sat with her arms at her sides and her eyes very bright, watching the screen, not speaking. On the stage, Victoria Harrington stood and let the room be what it needed to be. And in the back corner of the auditorium, standing against the wall, where he could see the whole room without being seen by most of it, Caleb Thompson watched. He watched the room the way he had watched every room for 30 years, completely quietly, from the angles. He watched Gerald in the back. He watched Derek near the front, whose posture had changed since the morning on the 4th floor in ways that probably even Derek hadn't fully registered yet. He thought about Maya, who had asked him last night when he came home later than usual. Daddy, did you fix it? He had sat on the edge of her bed and thought about that question for a long time. Not yet he had told her. But we started. She had accepted that with the practical wisdom of a 7-year-old who has learned that starting is a real thing, and not just a way adults avoid answering directly. "Okay," she said. "That's good then." Standing against the wall of the auditorium, watching the room, Caleb thought about what it meant to start something. Not to fix it, not to resolve it, to start it. To walk back into the building you built and say out loud in front of everyone, "This is what it was, and this is what it cost, and this is what we are going to do about it now." It was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the hard part. And standing there watching Caleb Thompson thought that the hard part was exactly where he had always done his best work. The months after the all-hands meeting did not feel like transformation. They felt like work. That was the thing. Nobody who watched corporate change from the outside ever fully understood the gap between the moment of declaration and the moment of reality was not filled with inspiration and momentum. It was filled with meetings that ran long and decisions that were harder than anticipated, and people who had heard promises before and were waiting with the patient skepticism of experience to see whether this time was different. Sandra came back to the building the week after the all-hands meeting. Not as an employee, she had left 18 months earlier and taken a position at a competitor that paid her less, but made her feel, as she told the investigation team, when they contacted her, like a person rather than a variable. She came back because Victoria had called her directly. Not through an assistant, not through a formal letter from HR. Victoria had found her number and called it on a Tuesday evening and said when Sandra picked up, "This is Victoria Harrington. I owe you a real conversation, and I'd like to have it if you're willing." Sandra had held the phone for a long moment. "Why?" she said. "Because 9 years of your work deserved better than what this company gave it," Victoria said. "And I need to hear from you directly what that cost, not from a report summary." Sandra came in on a Thursday afternoon. She sat across from Victoria in the office with the open door, and she talked for an hour and 40 minutes. And Victoria listened in the way that Caleb had been listening to people for 11 weeks, completely, without redirecting, without managing, without the subtle conversational maneuvers that powerful people use to keep a narrative from getting too uncomfortable. When Sandra finished, Victoria asked her one question. "What would have kept you here?" Sandra thought about it. "Someone asking me that question 4 years ago," she said. Victoria nodded slowly. "Would you consider coming back?" she asked. Sandra looked at her for a long time. "Not yet," she said. "But I'll tell you what. Ask me again in 6 months, and we'll see if the answer has changed." Victoria accepted this. She didn't push. She didn't offer a counter-proposal or an enhanced package or any of the tools she would have reached for automatically 6 months earlier to close a conversation toward the outcome she wanted. She said, "That's fair. I'll call you in 6 months." She did call, exactly 6 months later on a Tuesday evening from her own phone. And Sandra's answer had changed. She came back. Not to her old role. To a new one, leading a cross-functional team that had been built specifically around the product area, where her quiet 9-year body of work had generated more consistent results than any comparable function in the company. It was the role she should have been offered years earlier, built from the evidence that had always been there in the files and the numbers in the record of what she had actually produced while being passed over for meetings. She was never invited to attend. On Sandra's first day back, she walked past Gerald at the security desk. He smiled at her. "Welcome back, Sandra," he said. She stopped. She looked at him. "You remembered my name," she said. "I remember everybody's name," he said. She laughed, a real one, the kind that arrives without permission, and kept walking. Gerald watched her go and turned back to his monitor with the expression of a man who has decided that small dignities are not small at all. James sent Caleb the proposal by email on a Wednesday morning as instructed, and followed up 2 weeks later when he hadn't heard back also as instructed. The follow-up had been harder to send than he expected. He had written it and deleted it twice before sending it, because 18 months of non-response had trained him to interpret his own follow-through as a form of imposition, rather than a form of legitimate persistence. Caleb responded within 4 hours of receiving the follow-up. His response was 3 sentences. "I reviewed this thoroughly. It's excellent work. Can you meet Thursday at 10? James read those 3 sentences 4 times. Then he called his wife and read them to her over the phone. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "James, go to that meeting." "I'm going," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." The Thursday meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Caleb had authorized a pilot program built around James's proposal, with James leading it with a team of 6 people and a budget that James had never in his career been trusted to manage. It was not a favor. Caleb had gone through the proposal with the forensic attention he brought to every financial decision and had concluded, based on his own analysis, that the projected return justified the investment many times over. "I need to ask you something," James said near the end of the meeting. "Ask," Caleb said. "Why didn't anyone look at this before?" he said. Not with bitterness exactly, with the genuine bewilderment of someone who has done good work and cannot make the math of its invisibility add up. "I submitted it 3 times. I followed the process. The work was there." Caleb was quiet for a moment, because the system that was supposed to evaluate the work was evaluating something else at the same time, he said. And when a system has competing priorities, it defaults to the one that's easier to measure. James thought about this. And what was it measuring instead of the work? He asked. "Familiarity," Caleb said, "which is a lot easier to feel than to justify." James nodded slowly. "So what changed?" he asked. Caleb looked at him. "The system got examined," he said, "by someone who wasn't inside it." The pilot program launched 8 weeks later. Within 4 months, the results were ahead of the projection. Not marginally significantly. James presented the interim findings in an all-hands meeting that was streamed to every floor, standing at the front of the auditorium with his team behind him, and a data set that made its own argument without any assistance from the person presenting it. Caleb watched from the back of the room. He had a habit now in these months of watching from the back, not because he was hiding, but because the back of a room showed you things the front never could. It showed you the audience instead of the presenter. It showed you the cumulative reaction of a crowd in real time, the nodding, the stillness, the moments when attention sharpened because something true had been said. He watched the room during James's presentation. He watched people lean forward. He watched a senior director in the second row, a man who had been at the company for 8 years and had been part of the architecture of the old system, without fully understanding his own role in it, take out a notepad and start writing. He watched Kelsey, Victoria's assistant, watch the presentation with the expression of someone who is witnessing something they had been waiting for without knowing they'd been waiting. He thought, this is what it looks like when a company starts to remember what it was built for. 10. Derek came to Caleb's office on a Friday afternoon in the 4th month. He knocked on the open door. Caleb looked up. "Mr. Thompson," Derek said. He had started using the formal address, which Caleb found both unnecessary and somehow right, given where they'd both come from. "Derek," Caleb said. "Come in." Derek sat down in the chair across from the desk. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed an opening and then in the moment decided to abandon it. "I want to apologize," he said. "For what specifically?" Caleb asked. Not to make it harder, because specificity mattered, and he'd learned over many years that general apologies were often more about the person giving them than the person receiving them. Derek accepted the question. "For the first week," he said, "when I came to your desk and basically asked you to justify your presence, and for the month after that when I saw what Amanda was doing and I didn't say anything." He paused. "I told myself it wasn't my place." Which was a lie, I told myself, because it was more comfortable than the truth. "What was the truth?" Caleb asked. Derek looked at him. "The truth was that the system benefited me," he said. "I looked the part. I talked the part. I moved through this company in a way that made the people deciding things comfortable, and I knew it, and I used it, and I told myself it was because I was good at my job." He stopped. "And maybe I am good at my job, But I was also good at navigating a system that was tilted in my direction, and I didn't examine what that meant for the people it was tilted away from. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "That's an honest thing to say," he said. "It took me about 4 months to be able to say it," Derek said. "So I'm not claiming credit for speed." Caleb almost smiled. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. Derek sat forward. "There's a mentorship structure being set up," he said, "for employees who've been identified as high potential, but who haven't had access to the informal networks that usually drive advancement in places like this." He paused. "I want to be part of it, not as a beneficiary, as someone who knows how those informal networks work and can help people who've been excluded from them understand how to navigate them while we're in the process of making them more equitable." Caleb looked at him. "You've thought about this," he said. "For about 3 months, Derek said. "I almost came in here twice before today." "What stopped you?" Derek was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure if I was doing it for the right reasons," he said. "I didn't want to. I didn't want to show up here with a redemption arc that was really about making myself feel better. And now I think the reasons don't have to be pure to make the action useful," Derek said. "And I think waiting for pure reasons is another way of not doing the thing." Caleb held his gaze. "You're right," he said. "Talk to the program coordinator. Tell them I sent you." Derek nodded and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead. That first day when I came to your desk and basically interrogated you about why you were here." He stopped. "What were you thinking when I walked away?" Caleb considered this. "I was thinking," he said, "that you reminded me of someone I used to know." Derek frowned slightly. "Who?" "Me," Caleb said. 20 years ago, before I'd been on the other side of that conversation enough times to understand what it felt like." Derek stood in the doorway for a moment processing this. Then he nodded once and left. Caleb turned back to his desk. He sat with the quiet of the office for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Mrs. Patterson. "Is she ready?" he asked. "She's been ready for 20 minutes, Mrs. Patterson said. "She's been asking if you're going to be late." "Tell her I'm leaving right now," he said. He closed the notebook on his desk, a new one, the third since he'd started this process, and put on his jacket. The faded navy one. He still wore it. People had noticed, and a few people had asked about it, and he had explained without elaboration that it was the jacket he'd worn on his first day, and he saw no reason to retire it. The explanation was both entirely true and entirely incomplete, and he knew it, and he suspected most of the people he gave it to knew it too. He took the elevator down. Gerald was at his desk. "Heading out, Mr. Thompson?" "School pickup," Caleb said. Gerald smiled. "Tell Maya I said hello." He had met Maya once when Caleb had brought her to the building on a Saturday morning to pick up some files. She had walked in and immediately looked up at the atrium ceiling and said, "It's like a greenhouse in here, but without the plants," and Gerald had laughed for a long time. "I'll tell her," Caleb said. He walked out through the entrance. The street was ordinary. Traffic movement the particular momentum of a city afternoon. The 10 black SUVs were long gone. They had left the same evening. They arrived their purpose complete, the statement made and understood by everyone who needed to understand it. He walked to his car. He drove to Maya's school. She came out through the double doors in the particular organized chaos of school dismissal, scanning the line of cars with the focus of a child who has learned through years of a parent's consistent presence that looking is sufficient, that the person she's looking for will be there. She found him. She walked to the car with the unhurried certainty of someone who has nowhere else to be. She got in. She put her seatbelt on. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, baby." She looked at him for a moment in the way she had always looked at him, with those deep brown eyes that had come from Diane and that saw things he sometimes wasn't ready to have seen. "You look tired," she said. "Good tired," he said. "What's good tired?" He thought about how to explain it to a 7-year-old in a way that was both accurate and not reductive. Good tired is when you've been doing something hard, he said, and the hard thing is working. She considered this with the gravity of someone taking new information seriously. Is the company fixed? She asked. He had told her months ago that he was trying to fix something at work. He had not told her the full complexity of what fixing meant, but she had been asking in her intermittent and practical way ever since. It's getting better, he said. How much better? Enough that I can see the difference, he said. Not so much that the work is done. When will it be done? He looked at her for a moment. Some things don't have a done, he said. They have a direction. And as long as you keep moving in the right direction, you're doing it right. Maya absorbed this. That sounds hard, she said. It is, he agreed. But you like hard things, she said. Not as a compliment, just as a statement of observed fact, the way she cataloged information about him, the way children catalog information about their parents, building a picture of who this person is from thousands of small, consistent observations. I do, he said. She looked out the window. Okay, she said. They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then Maya said without turning from the window, Mommy would have thought what you did was cool. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. The thing about Diane was that she had always arrived in the middle of the unexpected moments, not the big occasions, but the Tuesday afternoons in the car, the ordinary minutes that turned out to be the ones that stayed with you. Yeah, he said. She always said you were the kind of person who did things the hard way because the easy way didn't mean anything, Maya said. I didn't know what that meant when she said it. I think I'm starting to understand it now. He kept driving. He didn't trust his voice for a moment. When he found it again, he said, She was right about that. Maya turned from the window and looked at him. I know, she said simply. 6 months after the all-hands meeting, Harrington International released its first public report on internal culture and hiring equity. It was not a press release. It was not a curated narrative about corporate progress. It was a document that had been written by the investigation firm in collaboration with the Employee Council that had been formed in the month since the all-hands. A council that included Sandra and James and Gerald, and a woman named Priya who had been watching things from her desk on the 4th floor for years with an accuracy nobody had asked her to share until now. The document was honest in a way that corporate documents rarely are. It named the failures specifically. It quantified the gaps that had existed. It described what had been done in the past 6 months to begin addressing them, and it was explicit that 6 months was not sufficient time to call anything resolved. It ended with a section that Caleb had written himself, which the board had debated, including, and ultimately agreed to publish in full. It read in part, The measure of a company is not what it achieves in its best moments. It is what it refuses to become in its hardest ones. This company was built on the belief that the person who arrives without the right jacket deserves the same consideration as the person who arrives with every advantage. We lost that belief gradually, the way organizations lose things not through a single decision, but through 1,000 small ones, each of which seemed reasonable in the moment and produced something unreasonable in aggregate. We are committed to earning that belief back, not through declaration, through the sustained, accountable daily work of being what we claim to be. This report is not the proof of that. It is the beginning of the process by which the proof will eventually be built. The report was covered by 3 industry publications. The commentary was divided. Some praised the transparency. Others were skeptical, and Caleb had anticipated that and believed it was right that skepticism was the appropriate response to any organization claiming to have examined itself and changed, and that the only answer to skepticism was time and consistency and results that could be independently verified. He read the coverage on a Monday morning in the storage room office on the 8th floor, which had long since stopped being a storage room and had been reconfigured into a proper workspace, though he'd requested that it remain modest. A desk, 2 chairs, a window, a bookshelf. On the bookshelf were 3 things. The first notebook, with its 43 pages of handwritten notes. A photograph of Diane. and a drawing Maya had made in the bright, imprecise crayon work of a 7-year-old who had been asked by her art teacher to draw something important to her. She had drawn a building blocky and slightly lopsided, the way buildings look when drawn by children who are more interested in what a building represents than in architectural accuracy, and in front of it, she had drawn 2 figures, a tall one and a short one holding hands. She had written underneath them in the careful block letters of someone learning to write, "My daddy fixed it." He had framed it. Victoria came to his office that Monday afternoon. She knocked even though the door was open, which had become her habit, a small gesture of a larger shift, the recognition that entering someone's space required acknowledgement regardless of the formal power dynamics between them. "Did you see the industry coverage?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "The skeptical pieces, too. Especially those," he said. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk. She looked different than she had 6 months ago. Not physically, the changes were not visible in any single feature. But there was something in the way she occupied the chair, a quality of presence that was less armored than it used to be, less prepared for the room to require her to defend herself at any moment. She had done the work, not perfectly. There had been moments in the past 6 months where the old habits had reemerged, the snap judgment, the closed door, the meeting that ran on autopilot rather than attention. And each time she had caught it herself, or someone had gently called it out, and she had done the uncomfortable thing of acknowledging it and doing it differently. She was learning, not with the speed of someone who had always been fast at things, with the stubbornness of someone who had decided they were not going to stop. "I had a call with Grace this week," she said. Caleb looked up. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Victoria said. "And harder than I expected, both at the same time." She paused. "She's not ready to come back. I don't know if she ever will be. But she said something that I've been thinking about since the call ended." "What did she say?" "She said she doesn't need this company to fix itself for her sake. She's built something good somewhere else. But she said—" Victoria stopped for a moment, then continued. "She said she has a daughter, and her daughter is 12 years old, and she is the kind of girl who is going to walk into buildings like this one in about 10 years. And Grace said she wants to believe that the building her daughter walks into will see her." She paused. "She said that's why she agreed to talk to us. Not for herself. For her daughter." Caleb was very still. Victoria looked at him. "I thought about Maya when she said it," she said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. They sat with that for a moment, the specific weight of it, 2 people in a building that had failed and was trying to be different, thinking about the daughters who would inherit whatever they built or failed to build. "Are we going to make it?" Victoria asked. Not the company performance question, the other one. Caleb looked at the drawing on the shelf. "I think the question isn't whether we make it," he said. "The question is whether we deserve to." He paused. "And the only way to deserve it is to keep doing the work on the days when it's hard and unglamorous, and when nobody's watching, and when it would be easier to declare it finished and move on." Victoria looked at the drawing too. "She thinks you fixed it," she said. "She's 7, he said. "She's also right," Victoria said. "About the part that matters. About the part where her father walked into a building and refused to let it stay the way it was." He looked at Diane's photograph. "I had help," he said. Victoria followed his gaze to the photograph. She had seen it before. It had been on the shelf since the first week he'd moved into this office. She had never asked about it, and he had never offered, and the photograph had simply been part of the room the way certain things become part of a space without needing to be explained. "She looks like Maya," Victoria said. "Yes," he said. "She always did." The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, that holds something without crushing it. After a while, Victoria stood. "I have a 3 o'clock, she said. "Go," he said. At the door, she stopped. It had become a pattern between them, the pause at the door, the thing that needed to be said before the conversation fully ended. He had come to expect it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For not walking away when you had every reason to," she said. For believing the company could come back to something worth believing in. She paused. And for giving me the chance to be part of what it comes back to, instead of just the reason it had to. He held her gaze. Don't thank me, he said. Prove it. She nodded once, and she went to her 3 o'clock. He turned back to his desk. Outside the window, the building street was doing what it always did in the afternoon, filling with the motion of people coming and going, arrivals and departures, the constant turnover of a city that did not pause to consider the significance of any individual moment. But inside the building, something was different than it had been a year ago. It was not fixed. It would not be fixed. Fixed was not the right word for what a company culture does. When it changes, it doesn't snap back to some original correct position like a reset bone. It shifts incrementally, painfully, with setbacks and reversals and moments of genuine progress that are sometimes only visible in retrospect. It shifts through the 1,000 daily decisions of the people inside it, the choice to see rather than look, to listen rather than manage, to ask rather than assume. What was different was the direction. A year ago, the company had been moving in a direction nobody had fully examined. Now it was moving in a direction people had chosen, not because they were forced to. Because they had seen in the form of one man in a faded jacket who had walked in through the front door and done the work nobody wanted to do and been seen for none of it. They had seen what it cost to let familiarity masquerade as merit. They had seen the bill that arrived when you led a company on autopilot and called it leadership. They had seen what happened when someone decided to stop accepting that bill and ask out loud in front of everyone, "What are we actually building here? And who are we building it for?" And the answer they were working toward imperfectly and stubbornly, and with the full understanding that it would take longer than they wanted and cost more than they expected, was everyone. Everyone who walks through the door, everyone who shows up in the wrong jacket, everyone whose name the security desk knows, and everyone whose name the security desk hasn't learned yet. Everyone who submits a proposal and waits 18 months and follows up because they believe against the evidence that the work speaks for itself. Everyone who has stood in an elevator going down holding a notebook, knowing that what they carried in it was more valuable than anyone in the building understood. Caleb Thompson picked up his pen. He opened the 3rd notebook to a fresh page. He wrote the date at the top, and then he began writing the next set of observations, not about what the company had been, but about what it was becoming. Not a record of failures, but a record of the slow, difficult, necessary process of a place learning to live up to what it had always claimed to believe. Because the story of Harrington International did not end when the 10 black SUVs arrived. It did not end when Richard Coleman bowed his head on the sidewalk. It did not end when Victoria Harrington stood on a stage and said the words she should have said sooner. It continued the way all real things continue, in the daily accumulation of small decisions made by people who had decided to pay attention. The man they dismissed because of his jacket became the man who saved their company. The father they underestimated became the leader every one of them would spend years trying to understand. And the truth he carried into that building, not in his title, not in his ownership stake, not in the 10 black SUVs that announced who he was to a world that had already decided the truth he carried, was simple enough that a 7-year-old could draw it in crayon and get it exactly right. Your worth was never in your jacket. It was never in your name. It was never in who recognized you when you walked through the door. It was in the work. It was in the notebook. It was in showing up day after day in a building that hadn't learned to see you yet, and doing the thing that needed doing, and trusting. Not blindly, not without cost, but with the deep-earned, unshakable trust of someone who had built something real from nothing. Trusting that the truth, given enough time and enough light, finds its way to the surface. And the people who try to bury it, they always end up standing in its light.